Hello, everyone, and welcome to Content Strategy in Technical Communication. My name is Sarah O'Keefe, and I will be doing this webcast today. A couple of quick housekeeping items. Everyone on the call other than me is muted. You do have the option of participating, though, through the questions area for questions that you want me to see, and through the chat area for things that perhaps you want your fellow attendees to see and comment on. But if you would like me to address a question during this webcast, be sure to put it in the questions area. We will be recording this webcast, and it typically will be available within a day or two of when we actually deliver the presentation. I want to especially thank those of you who are attending from a suboptimal kind of time zone. And I also see a number of new faces or new names and also some old friends on this one, so I am glad to have you all here. What I want to do today is talk about content strategy and how this applies in particular to technical communication issues and what this means for you if you are either responsible for TechComm or working as a technical writer or something like that. So a couple of quick things about me. I run a company called Scriptorium Publishing. We're based in North Carolina, but we have customers all over the world. I co-authored with my coworker here, Alan Pringle, a book called Content Strategy 101 not too long ago. And my particular interest as a consultant and as a professional over my career is in the collision of content publishing and technology and what that does for us. One of the very first things that I want to touch on in dealing with content strategy is that we need to collectively learn to talk the language of business. It is fun, and I'm sure many of you have done this, and I know I have. It is certainly fun to turn up our noses at the MBA types and the people who only care about business and only talk about business. But the reality is that business thinking is how money gets approved and how projects get done. So to really just focus on the technological purity of a particular thing is not that helpful because it won't get us anywhere. And that brings me to probably the most important thing that we run into. When I go in and talk to people about potential strategies, here is a new strategy that could help with information. Here is a way that we could do this. We're going to have to invest to fix this localization problem. By far, the most common response that I get from tech writers is they'll never pay for that. They won't pay for an upgrade, they won't pay for scripting, they won't pay for training, and they certainly won't pay for a great big, enormous, expensive content management system. And while it is historically true that there hasn't been a lot of investment in the TechComm space, what's really going on here is not that executives won't pay for something. It is, in fact, that executives can't see a reason to pay for it because they don't see the value of what you're asking for. I hope that you've had lunch or dinner or whatever meal is closest to you, because I'm afraid I do have quite a lot of chocolate-related slides. So executives don't see the value to, can we upgrade this, or can we get a new system, or can we whatever? And this is largely our fault, because what has happened is that these requests have historically been presented as technical requests. I want this because it enables some technical thing. They are not presented as business requests, and that's where we need to go with this. So instead of asking for cool toys, you have to prove that your approach saves money. If you ask for a $200 scripting tool, you say, I want this because I'm spending 10 hours a week doing inefficient, repetitive things. This script will automate it. I invest that once. I save 10 hours a week going forward. That's kind of the basic of how do you do a business case. And for a bigger project, you're going to have to do an actual, full-blown, formal business case. But at the end of the day, it's, I want X dollars because I can save Y dollars. Or I want X euros because I can save Y euros, and the savings is greater than the cost. The flip side of this is I want us to invest X dollars because then we will get Y dollars in additional revenue. But that's basically what we're looking for. Now, in TechComm, we have these three major patterns for business case. There's the issue of legal and regulatory stuff, there's controlling cost, and there's marketing and product visibility. And within that, there's localization, which I'll talk about separately. And what we want to do is basically say, okay, we have this legal and regulatory issue, and if we refine or fix or change our TechCom process, we can address it and we can do a better job. So you want to bring TechCom along for the ride. Now, I'm afraid this means that I have compared our businesses and our TechCom to loons and loon babies, respectively, but that seems sort of accurate for a lot of what I've done, so we'll go with it. So the legal and regulatory case, if you have this requirement, I'm sure you know about it. If you're in the pharmaceutical industry, you have drug labels. Medical devices are regulated. Legal disclaimers in the U.S. tend to be somewhat regulated, or at least subject to your legal department's review. And then, of course, Europe has the Product Documentation Directive and the Machinery Directive and some similar things like that. Your basic business case when it comes to legal and regulatory issues is that you want to have more efficient compliance. We must do this or we will be sued. We must do this or we will have regulatory problems. We will be told that we are not allowed to ship. So it's a very, very straightforward kind of thing where you say, we have to do this because otherwise we will not be allowed to do business, or we will be put out of business, or we will have legal issues. That's a very straightforward kind of argument to make, and I think everybody understands that. Most of us, however, are not in regulated industries. So we have to look at some other things. Now, controlling the cost of TechCom is one place where we want to go look, and we want to look for efficiency, we want to look at cost of tech support, and we want to look at collaboration issues. But before we do that, I want to take a little sidebar and talk about cheap documentation, because this is not what we're talking about. Cheap documentation tends to be quite expensive in all the ways that count, which is everything other than the actual cost of producing the cheap and not so good documentation. Cheap documentation means you end up with a bad reputation. It means you end up with product returns and maybe lawsuits. And in many cases that I've seen, this perceived cheap process where people are not trained and they don't have any decent tools and they're just sort of floundering along producing garbage, it would actually be cheaper to put in a reasonable process and some reasonably trained people who are much, much more efficient than it is to do it the quote-unquote cheap way. So typical problems you run into with cheap docs are they're hard to understand because they're not very good. Their formatting is bad, the writing is bad, the organization is bad, the output type is not what people want, and they don't arrive on time. So there are these huge delays before the docs are available. Useless content. In the name field, type the person's name. Well, thank you so much. No, this is not information. It's just letters on a page. So all of these things tend to happen when you have cheap documentation and you haven't thought through a strategy. What you don't want is essentially for TechCom to sort of get, pecked to death by all these various things. When you have bad content, it can have huge cost implications across the organization. And if you can quantify these issues and say, these are the problems we've run into, this is where it's costing us money, then you can go in and invest in getting a better process in place for the technical content. So quantify these issues, get some funding, and move it forward that way. I have seen each and every one of these issues occur in organizations that needed better technical content and a better strategy to drive them. So we want to make an argument for efficient content development. Not the cheapest possible, but let's not waste money where we don't have to. In particular, don't copy and paste. A friend of mine came up with the idea that if you're copying and pasting, you're doing it wrong. Set up links and reuse information instead of copying and pasting. And this adds up very, very quickly when you standardize even just a little note or a warning and start using it consistently, because A, you don't have to remember what that warning looked like. You just go and retrieve it and use it. And B, when this content goes for translation, which for many of you it does, you end up having that translated once and then reused all over the place. Now, given that typical cost of translation, if we're just estimating, is 25 cents per word per language. So let's say you have an 8-word note. Well, that's a $2 cost to translate into one language, which means if you have it in 10 languages, that's $20, and you reuse it 100 times, it can either cost you, $20, or it could cost you some multiple of that because the note isn't exactly the same everywhere because it wasn't copied and pasted properly, or somebody forgot to update it, or all these kinds of things. So reuse is very, very important. It makes it easier to keep track of stuff. It reduces the amount of stuff that you actually have to manage because you only have one copy of that note. Adds up very, very quickly. Formatting and production is another place where we can be more efficient. So templates, automated formatting, less writing and more formatting. We can use software to automate the pagination, automate the tables of contents, and all those kinds of things, and use software to generate all of our required outputs instead of doing it by hand or tweaking things or doing all these manual workarounds, all these kinds of things. The rough estimate that we use is that writers spend somewhere around 20% of their time on just straight up formatting tasks, fixing the page breaks in the PDF type stuff in less efficient content development environments. We've seen this number go much, much, much higher, like 50% or even higher. But 20%, that means that if you have a group of 5 writers, then one writer, effectively, you have 4 writers and 1 formatter. And you can do the math on what that formatter costs you per year. So we look at this question of, can we automate that? Can we produce these outputs in an automatic fashion and do a good job at it and not have this issue of formatting costs and formatting constantly being done over and over and over again? This is one place where I see a huge opportunity for cost savings and efficiency without affecting the quality of the documents. Now, every time I say that, I get somebody saying, oh, but we'll never be able to do automation as well as we produce PDFs because our PDFs require us to do this and this and this and all these little nitpicky things, and on they go. Now, it is true that when you automate, it is difficult to do that last 5 or 10% of formatting, that last little bit that sort of makes it extra beautiful and makes it magazine quality. That is true. However, what I've found from experience is that the pushback that we get on formatting, when people say, no, we can't possibly make our formatting match, the automated workflow match the hand-done, the handcrafted way that we're doing it now. So far, I have not run across an organization that was handcrafting output that was producing anything that I considered to be even remotely attractive. They're producing these horrible-looking PDFs, and they're clinging to them, and you look at it and you say, it is not 1965. You can step away from these kinds of things. This thing is not attractive. We can actually do a better job if we get away from the hand production. Now, I'm sure that there are people out there doing really, really nice stuff, but they tend to be very flexible about formatting and saying, okay, well, we can give in on that thing to get more automation because we don't need it that badly. The people that tend to cling to we can't change it ever, ever, ever are asking for things that are just really, in my very subjective opinion, kind of horrible looking. Localization. Localization is, to coin a phrase, the big kahuna. If you have localization, you need really, really good tech comm because otherwise your localization, your translation process is going to cost you a fortune. Any inefficiency you have in the source language, any defects you have in the source content will be multiplied across all the languages that you produce. And it is not at all uncommon to have just unbelievable costs in translation that are entirely due to what is effectively bad source content. So to give you some examples of bad things in source content that are caused by, a lack of strategic thinking about what the content should be and how it should be. Bad use of tools, terrible, terrible implementations. And I'm talking here about files that are hand formatted. They don't use styles. When they use styles, the styles are not consistent. They're not consistent from one document to the next. The text itself is inconsistent. So my warning or note example it uses different text. Every time that warning occurs that says, don't stick a fork in the power outlet, it uses a slightly different wording, and it's not the same. So sometimes it says power outlet, and sometimes it says wall outlet, and sometimes it says something completely different. And then the expectation is, of course, that this will be consistent in the output in Spanish or Italian or French or German or Japanese, and it isn't. And then the reviewers look at it and say, well, why is this different in Japanese? And you go back and look at the source language and say, oh, because, well, the source language wasn't consistent. So all sorts of problems like that. Badly written content, verbose content, content that uses jargon and slang and things that are hard to translate that cause problems for translation downstream. You really have to think about translation on the day that you start thinking about content and developing your content, not on the day that you finish your English content and then think, oh, well, now let's think about German. No. You have to think about it, and you have to plan for it from day one, and that needs to be part of the overall strategy. What languages is this going into, and how are we going to deal with this? As you move forward with content and with information, you need to think about what kind of scalability is required for your information. If you have bad content and just sort of get it out the door by doing whatever it takes, some sort of heroic effort by your writers and your content people, you will not be able to scale your content. Now, that's okay when you have 100 pages of content and one writer, or even 500 pages of content and 2 writers. It is not okay when you have 10 writers and 5,000 pages of content, of which 3,000 changes in a given year, and you're going to 20 languages. At that point, you have to start thinking carefully about workflows, about the value of the content, and how this content is being developed, because otherwise, what would be the point? So scalability increases with good workflow and with good content, by which I mean content that follows the rules that you've established. So you have to think about that pretty carefully right at the very beginning. I want to talk a little bit about technical support. This is an excellent source for cost justifications and for changing the strategy that you're taking with your tech content. Basically, the better the content is, the lower your tech support costs. And the reason for that is something called call deflection. If you can produce better content, that probably means fewer people will pick up the phone and call and ask a question, which tends to be the most expensive way of helping people. So technical support cost is something like 6 to 20% of revenue. That higher number is for smaller companies, or $6 to $36 per transaction, per call, per email, per forum post, perhaps. So the implications of this are that if you have a $100 million a year revenue company and you can get 1% call deflection, you save something like $72,000 per year. And at 2%, you'd be up at about $140,000 per year. The numbers we've seen anecdotally are much, much higher than this. But, of course, people also usually call us when they have big problems. So it's not too surprising that the people in the worst shape would, have very gaudy statistics here. Now, when you go and talk to the phone support people and you say to them, what is the biggest obstacle that you have to providing efficient phone support? The answer that we're hearing from a variety of our customers is this. They are all exceedingly frustrated with load time on monster PDFs. The tech support person is on the phone, they have an irate customer, they need to provide information, and they're waiting for a PDF to open. Second biggest complaint we get is bad search. I can't find what I'm looking for. I can't figure out where it is. If you can quantify the cost of waiting for content to load, quantify the cost of searching for information, quantify the cost of these wait times, these longer calls, these frustrated customers, those are all really useful places to go to think about how can I justify investment in TechCom. Now, I want to talk a little bit about something that we've seen in this area that we find quite troubling, and we've seen this in numerous companies now, and that is that there is an increasing amount of conflict between tech comm and tech support. The way this seems to work is that tech support is very unhappy with the content that they are getting from the tech comm organization for a variety of reasons. Usually it's all in PDF. We're not happy with the content itself. It's not up to date. And it doesn't cover what we need, and perhaps we can't find it because of search issues. What tends to happen as a result is that they go off and they start writing their own content. That's actually not the first thing they do. The first thing they do is they start making copies of content, because once they finally dig something up in a PDF somewhere, they say, oh, there it is. Let me copy and paste this and stick it in a private cache somewhere so that I can keep track of it. That means that now if you update that PDF, they won't see it because they're now referring to their own private copy of that information. The second thing that happens is that tech support takes the information that TechComm is producing and rewrites it, adds, updates, deletes, whatever. We've seen cases where tech support put up their own wiki and just started dumping information into the wiki. And that helps because it's fast and it's timely and it's potentially useful because it's only the stuff that tech support cared enough about to put in the wiki. But now TechComm is very unhappy because, well, that hasn't been reviewed. It hasn't been approved. It may or may not be accurate. Sometimes it's accurate for scenario A but not for scenario B, and that disclaimer isn't there. Just a really bad kind of conflict. These two organizations should be allies because essentially tech support is the first and perhaps primary consumer of TechComm content within an organization. But instead they're at each other's throats because they're arguing about producing content fast enough. So this has to be fixed. And the way to fix this is to treat tech support much less like a whiny child and much more like a customer. They want their information sooner. They can't wait 6 months. Okay, what can we do to address that? They don't like the search in PDF. They don't like getting 800-page PDFs. Okay, let's give them something other than 800-page PDFs. They want the ability to leave comments. We can do that. We could even hide those comments from the customers if the comments are of particular concern in terms of not wanting the customers to see that. We can do all these things, but that conversation needs to happen, and right now it doesn't necessarily happen. Another aspect that we need to look at in terms of strategy is collaboration across the organization. What can we do to integrate TechComm into some of the other information that's out there that's being produced? Technical support information, product design and development, marketing should be on here, training, education, software, online help, and interface labels. I don't like the word leverage, but if you can get training to reuse information, to leverage your information that's built in TechComm instead of copying and pasting, well, then maybe we could negotiate that they contribute to the initial procedural task instead of rewriting it later. Let's just write it together and then both use a single task. Can we get that to work? Product interface labels. We want to be sure that the product interface label that says end call or hold is consistent between the product itself and the button on the product and the documentation that describes it. So it's important to integrate those things together and get them up and running. So a collaboration workflow isn't necessarily going to have all these arrows on it in a single organization, but it might. And there might be additional boxes here, but you want to think about where are those opportunities and which direction does the information flow? Is it a two-way flow or is it a one-way flow? What kinds of things can we exchange and can we share and can we collaborate on instead of being some sort of a technical content silo within the organization? Marketing and product visibility is a critical place to go to think about how can we begin to use technical content broadly as a strategic asset to the organization. And three of the things you can do have to do with really marketing, product visibility, and sort of public-facing information. TechComm content can reinforce or distract from the marketing message. So if your TechComm content effectively is presented in this way, what does that say about this particular, in this case, in this particular store? And if you have a different kind of presentation of your TechCom content, what does that say? This, by the way, says to me, I'm really expensive, which I'm okay with that because it's chocolate, and I like chocolate. But this message is, I'm expensive, and if you look at the first one again, the message here is, I'm a huge mess, but you might find some bargains in here. So neither one of those is right or wrong. It's just a matter of being aware of the message that you're conveying with your content. Product documentation can explicitly help people make the decision to buy or to not buy software. Here's a case where a company explicitly says, hey, would you like to read our documentation before you buy the product? We know you're going to need it, and we know you're worried, so here you go. Why don't you read it and see what you think? They do the same thing with support. Tired of listening to fake support promises? This is an explicit appeal to say, we're different, we do this well, you should buy from us. You can use product documentation to increase the visibility and the understanding of your product. This means that product documentation has to be basically public-facing. So in order to use content, technical content, to make people more aware of your product, you have to put the content out there where people can see it. And so there are three aspects of this: searchable, findable, discoverable. Searchable means that Google and other search engines can see your content. That means information that is public, that is on the web, that is out there in the world. You could maybe make a case for put it behind a customer login, but at that point, nobody's going to discover your content that is not already a customer. If you're trying to find new customers, you have to put at least some of your content out there in order to use it. So searchable means visible to search engines. Findable is something a little bit different. Findable means that when you go to a search engine and you search for information, your content comes up, so they find your content. Searchable is a prereq for findable. And findability tends to be a, really kind of a big problem because it turns out it's actually quite difficult to make content findable. And finally, you have discoverable. The simplest way of explaining discoverable is to say that people link to it, but that's not exactly right. Discoverable means that you stumble across it when you weren't explicitly searching for it, or perhaps you were searching, but you ran across a third-party blog post, and then based on the third-party blog post, you ended up at some other site. So discoverable requires you to think about your social media, your publishing strategy in terms of putting information out there. Maybe you have things like guest posts going on that go onto other related sites, and then from there maybe people come back to your site, that type of thing. But discoverability is mostly reputational. The better a reputation you have, the more likely it is that people will link and people will include your stuff, your content, in the conversation. So that conversation that's happening online in all those social media is what makes your content potentially discoverable. Not a lot of ways of controlling discoverability other than putting out good content and promoting it in some obvious ways, but at the end of the day, this is up to the user community to really push that. And speaking of user community, that's another one that you want to make available. You want to think about this. How can I support the user community? How can I make participation appealing to them? Most of us probably don't have products that people are clamoring to try out, but some of us do, and if you're in the lucky position of producing chocolate, then you should be okay with this. If what you really want is you want to get to a point where users are like this, they are obsessed with your product, they love it, and they want to participate. This, by the way, is a real store in Asheville, North Carolina. It has fantastic chocolate, and we like it. So the key here is that we really need to align TechCom with business. We need to understand the business case for what's being done and what the business drivers are, and not just, hey, look, isn't that pretty, or isn't that cute. So the business case is, our business goal is whatever. TechComm needs to do something to support that, and doing that will cost some money, but it will increase revenue. So an example business case to look at, and localization is the one that tends to drive a lot of the projects that we're working on. So the way this looks is that a company comes to us and says, you know, right now we have a 6-month lag. When we ship our English language product, we have a 6-month lag before we can ship in Europe, because we have to do translation. And we really want to get that down to more like a week or two. How can we do that? What can we do? Well, and you go off and you start looking at the localization process, and you will discover that it is very manual. There's hardly any reuse. Everything's being sort of translated again from scratch because of a variety of nasty technical problems. And probably you'll discover that the source content is not optimized for localization. So you come back and say, okay, well, we're going to need to spend some money to fix the source, fix the style, fix the terminology, fix all these things, and then do something about incremental localization so that we don't have these huge gaps. So, you know, pretty big kind of strategic issues, and potentially costly strategic issues. But let's say that the European market and its 26 or so languages is worth, you know, $100 million a year to this organization, for the sake of argument. That means if it takes them 6 months to get over into Europe, that's half of that, so that's $50 million that they didn't get in the first 6 months. And if we divide that again, you'll discover that it's, you know, nearly $10 million a month, right? Something like $9 million a month in revenue. Well, what's the value of getting $9 million in those first, say, 5 months? You still have a month lag instead of a 6-month lag. So if you can accelerate by 5 months, what's the value of getting 9 million, 9 million, 9 million, 9 million, 9 million? That's where you go to get your business case and say, if we can squeeze this down, we'll do much better, and we get that cash in that much faster. Those are the kinds of discussions and arguments that we're having at this point. And at that point, the question of, are we spending $50 or $100 or $150,000 on tools, it's not an irrelevant question, but we really have to start with the question of how big is the company and what kind of revenues are we looking at before we start saying, oh my God, they'll never pay for that. Because they will. In many cases, they will. Now, having said that, I know that many of you, including me, are not big fans of math and spreadsheets, so I'll just throw in a duckling and make us all feel better. I have a set of sample business cases in our Content Strategy 101 book, which is available at contentstrategy101.com. It also does include sample cost calculations, so you might want to go there and take a look at that, see if there's anything there that's helpful. And the book itself, actually the entire book, is actually available there. If you want to buy it, that's fine by me, but you can also get all of the content free on the companion website. And with that, I believe I'm ready to take some questions. I'll also put up the contact slide in a second, but are there questions out there that you want to address? And I'll start by answering the one that we seem to get in every session, which is, well, you know, what about XML? Should I be doing this? And actually, usually it's, should I be doing DITA? Is that the right strategy for me? The answer is, of course, it depends. There's no telling whether that's right for you or not. It might be. It might not be. You need to go back and ask the question of, what are we trying to do here, and what are our business goals? And that can be difficult. Is the goal of the business to go faster, deliver content faster? Is it to be in a particular market area? What is the business trying to accomplish, and how can you contribute to that? That's the question that really needs to be answered. And that's a hard question, especially if we haven't been looking at this, you know, sort of at the strategic level. It can be quite challenging to try and move up several levels and think about this if that's not something that you've been forced to do before. So I would definitely encourage you, rather than starting with the question of tools or technologies or architectures, start with the question of what are we trying to accomplish here, and work your way over from there. All right, I'm going to put up the contact slide, and I will leave that there, and I'm going to go take a look at the questions tab and see if there are other questions that are coming in. What would you like to know? So about localization, if we do not have localization, where do you go with this business case development? If you don't have localization, look at the question of where your markets are, what the organization is trying to accomplish. Are you trying to grow? Are you trying to scale? Are you trying to get mind share from software developers? What are you trying to do? And take it from there. So understand where the organization is going and what the priorities are. If you're regulated, look at the regulatory questions. How do I suggest that tech writers learn to talk with MBAs? It's a process, and I think there's also, it's probably reasonable to point out that the MBAs also need to learn to talk with the tech writers. This is not entirely a one-way street, because I did have somebody who, and I think they were serious, in all seriousness, said to me, well, isn't there some way to just have software that translates the content? And I said, well, yeah, it's called Google Translate, and if you try it, you're going to discover it's not so good. It's not so pleasant. It doesn't give you high-quality translation. And, really, he couldn't believe that there wasn't software out there that would just do this. So that's a conversation that needs to happen, to say, no, localization is a process. It's complicated. This is what it looks like. But I think that from a tech writer point of view, in talking to MBAs, an acknowledgement that business and the goals of the business are important and relevant, and an acknowledgement that while we as tech comm people may be interested in questions of grammar and questions of page presentation and design, and we don't have to be uninterested in those, but we also need to learn to talk about why it's important to produce what we're producing. And it's not because we've always had a user's guide. It's because that user guide serves a particular purpose as part of the business. I don't find it to be, terrifically irrelevant. All right, question about the tech support distinction. Is it appropriate for tech support to create and maintain a knowledge base, and how do you distinguish between a knowledge base article and one that belongs in general customer documentation? That's a good question, and I think you've actually answered it yourself, because the answer is in that phrase, general customer documentation. Knowledge base articles have a tendency to be things that are very specific. If you're using Windows 8 and you haven't updated to this service pack and you're running this kind of a server and some other condition, then you're going to run into this problem, and here's how to work around it. Or if you're on a slow connection, you need to do these kinds of things. It's not a really, really clear distinction, but knowledge base articles have a tendency to be scenario-based rather than general. However, that said, I would ask the question of, can you put unified search across the knowledge base and the general customer docs? I mean, can you search across both of them? Because if I'm your customer, I don't care. I have a problem and I want the answer, but I don't particularly want to have to search in two places. I just want you to give me the information that I need. So that is a, there's a reasonable distinction to be made based on specific versus general, but it's a little bit tricky. And I would also look carefully at the question of, can you make them searchable? Also, searchable in one step. And also, do you have a process for promoting knowledge base information into the general customer docs? Maybe it starts life as a knowledge base article, but it ends up over in the documentation. Maybe that's a placeholder. But I think it's critical to understand what that workflow is and the direction that information tends to go. So to really think about what's the relationship between these two things. How are they the same? How are they different? Do you derive one from the other? That's a common workflow in places that are a little bit less dysfunctional than some of the ones that I tend to run into. Somebody wants to know where can we get those Aloha chocolates, and I do believe the answer is in Hawaii. So, entertaining question there. All right. Anything else that you guys want to address? If not, I'm going to wrap this up early and we can all go off and do something productive with our afternoon or evening, or I guess first thing in the morning. If any of you are on the first thing in the morning shift, I'm really, really sorry, and thank you for coming. All right, with that, if you have any other questions, feel free to email me, and we will talk soon. Thank you all.